Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you again so much for joining Pyxera Global for part 2 of our second conversation in our Rhetoric to Action series, where we explore various approaches and components to dismantling structural racism. Our first conversation that we had with our esteemed panelists that I will reintroduce shortly, but that you see here on the screen, was so rich, so robust, and so much fun that we had to continue it. I'm excited to hear from them again today. Hard to believe that it's been about a month since we last spoke, but you will hear from them very shortly. As a reminder, our intent is that through these conversations in our Rhetoric to Action series, you are able to walk away with tangible, actionable ideas of things that you and your organization can do to contribute to the undoing of unjust systems and the building to new equitable ones. So rejoining me today, as a reminder, is Dr. Amberly Banerjee, who is joining us from London in the UK and is currently a director at GSK, where she sits with the Global Regulatory Affairs team and is accountable for governance activities for the HIV portfolio. So welcome back, Amberly. We're also joined by Rebecca Stevenson, who sits in Geneva, Switzerland, where she is currently the head of global health partnerships with Novartis, where she secures and implements partnerships to develop medicines for diseases that disproportionately affect the developing world and poor, vulnerable populations. Welcome back, Rebecca. And last but certainly not least, we have Bruno Honorio, who is joining us from Sao Paulo, Brazil. Bruno is a professor and speaker in the area of digital market research, with a focus on digital ethnography and qualitative and quantitative research techniques that aim to deepen user and consumption behavior of online content and brand products. What a mouthful. Welcome back, Bruno. So before we dive in today's conversation, let's remind our viewers of what we discussed for the first conversation and what we hope to speak about a bit today. So again, the overall intention of our conversation is to highlight issues of race that are not just US issues. In part 1, we broadly discussed how companies can change or leverage their responses in the US to influence racial justice globally, how we can learn from each other, and how we can truly learn to perceive structural racism and social injustice for the global issues that they really are. We spoke a bit about how parts of the UK, Switzerland, and Brazil have amplified race-related issues this year, largely with influence from the US, an influence that has been amplified in the US. And so we spoke a bit about what that has looked like in other parts of the world. About some of the specific areas of injustices that have showed up in the UK, in Switzerland, and Brazil, whether it be incarceration rates, death at the hands of police, disparities in education, maternal deaths, and more. Bruno also educated us on the sheer diversity of Brazil, noting that 54% of the Brazilian population is Black. That was eye-opening for me. And we also touched on how race has been politicized, especially in light of the recent US presidential elections, and what that might mean for the rest of the world. So the last bit of level setting that I wanted to revisit here today, in addition to summarizing what we spoke about last time, is also to, before I turn it over to the panelists, is also to revisit the illustration of the issues that we spoke about and really demonstrate how they are interconnected and complex, interdependent. There are several terms that are associated with the issues that we're going to continue to speak about that are often used interchangeably. And so while they're not synonymous, they are closely connected and they share common values. So just wanted to spend a quick moment to remind everyone what we are speaking about and what we hope to accomplish here. So social justice, by definition, is the equal distribution of wealth, opportunities, and privileges within a society. Social injustices are often rooted in trauma and often involve inequities in education, healthcare, economics, and so on. Social justice refers to justice within society at large. Structural racism is a form of racism that is embedded as normal practice within society or an organization, meaning the inequities that result from the racism have become the norm and are easier to overlook. So structural racism refers to both society and organizations. And then last but certainly not least is DE&I, often referred to as spelled out as diversity, equity, and inclusion, is referred to within the context of an organization or business and involves respecting each person's uniqueness, fair and equal treatment of all, and that everyone feels accepted. So DE&I truly is a business imperative. But often the default conversation when we speak about a corporation's role in affecting structural racism and social justice. So wanted to amplify this here and just highlight that we're not speaking just about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but really the intersections between it, structural racism, and social justice, and how corporations truly do have a role to play in affecting each of these buckets toward just societies. So again, I'm going to stop talking. I know you don't want to hear from me. I want to hear from our panelists. So we are going to dive in. Oh, before we dive in, I almost forgot to do a recap of what we are so excited to hear from everyone today. I forgot to do a recap of what it was that our panelists left us with last time. So as you see here, we were instructed to look at the local data, take into consideration the local context before making decisions, developing policies, and making commitments. You need to understand the reality of what's happening where you're operating, and then make informed decisions from there. Be intentional about cross-sectoral and cross-border partnerships. I think the sheer nature of this conversation demonstrates that there's so much in common. We're all experiencing so many similarities that you don't need to go it alone. There's so much that we can learn from each other and so much that we can share with each other as we do forward. Don't devalue or underestimate the societal impact you can achieve as a company. Again, don't default back to the DE&I conversation, but really understand and really take a moment to realize the power that the company has to actually make societal impact. Ensure the voices of the populations of the most affected are part of the process toward finding solutions. I think we all, I know my esteemed panelists here all have experienced and have witnessed that oftentimes decisions are made that affect certain populations and certain communities, and those communities are not part of the conversation toward developing those solutions. So the way to really develop sustainable solutions is to have those people who are most affected at the table. Equip human resources professionals with knowledge on structural racism and strategies to prevent bias. Those who are in positions of decision-making, those who are in positions of really ensuring that there is equitability across the global footprint, across the global organization, really need to be educated from the beginning and not just trained on 1 or 2 DE&I sessions, but really have depth understanding back to that local data of what the realities are in the communities where the company operates. Nurture the talent pipeline, both inside and outside of the company. Invest in education and the future of your workforce. To me, it's a no-brainer. It means really invest in the community. Invest in the places where your organization operates and where you will be drawing your talent from. That is the next wave of leadership for your company. Including diverse voices in decisions is critical. So kind of back to those who are most affected being part of the process, but also be mindful of the balance of power. It's not enough to have diverse voices at the table if you don't address the power dynamics and the baggage that both sides or all sides are bringing to the table. Not much, will be achieved. It will be ceremonious, if anything, to have a beautiful array of diverse faces, but not much will be achieved beyond that. Be a visible, active, and vocal role model in championing anti-racism. And for me, this one links very closely to the next one of leaders don't lead from titles, they lead from where they are. So being a role model, being an active champion is not relegated just for the C-suite, not just relegated for the vice presidents and the senior leadership team, but really is something that can be embodied by anyone at any aspect of the company. Team, did I forget anything? Give me a thumbs up if I got it all. I got so excited to hear from you and I just ran right through. Great. So with that said, let's dive into our conversation for today. And Bruno, I would love to start with you. Since we last spoke, Brazil has celebrated the Brazilian Black Awareness Day, which was Friday, November 20th. So Can you tell us a bit about the day? Tell us a bit about the turn of events and any positives that have or will come from it?
So first of all, thank you, Renee. Good afternoon for everyone. I'm really, really excited and happy to be here again. It's a great pleasure to be here with you and Emily and Rebecca. I'm very happy. So about our Brazilian awareness, Black Awareness Day. It's a really important moment for Black people here in Brazil because we use the day to make some manifestations, to make some statements about our Blackness, about our people. But here in Brazil these years, we don't have a really good day. uh, Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of good news to tell you after our first conversation, but on the day, exactly on November 20, on Black Awareness Day, a man was murdered by a security, a Black man was murdered by a security team inside a supermarket, just because he's made a complaint about the prices, just about the prices. He lost their life because the price of the rice. uh, so after this tragedy received a global process around the world. People talk about it, this thing. But after this tragedy, more two kids was murdered by police when they were just playing on the street. The police was shot these two little kids. So we don't have a lot of positive things, but I bring to you some the only positive things that I find after that about the murder inside a supermarket store. The positive point was the manifestations here in Brazil, in São Paulo and Rio Grande do Sul, Porto Alegre, when we can see white and Black people fighting together inside in these manifestations. And the most important, these people put fire, literally put fire in some stories here in São Paulo. And this never happened here because we only say, oh, Black Lives Matter, oh, Black Lives Matter, but we don't do nothing. In this time, we put fire on the stories. This is not a better thing to do, but it's something, because this showed that Black people here in Brazil was very tired. We are tired. I'm tired. I'm tired to speak all the time, and sometimes I need to do something. So after this tragedy, weeks after, 1 or 2 weeks after this, the responsible supermarket created a racial committee. So with some very important Black people here in Brazil, writers and singers and people from marketing. So, and they create this committee, but until now, after 1 month later, we don't see anything, any change. So, and on this same day of this Black man was murdered, our vice president made this declaration. I read for you. The racism in Brazil doesn't exist. This is an outside thing that people try to bring to Brazil. And our president did not care about. Said nothing. And this kind of behavior reflects directly in the Brazilian companies. As something like, if our president doesn't care, we don't need to do anything either. So unfortunately, the situation here is worse than ever because we don't have a government and neither companies support of companies. And here, the most part of white people that have the power like this kind of situation, because nothing changed for them, and this is great, but just for white people. So I'm sorry to start with this in this way, but here in Brazil, we don't have a lot of good news to tell, unfortunately.
Thank you, Bruno, for sharing that. And please do not apologize. You are just reflecting back the reality. You're only sharing the facts. So thank you for sharing those facts with us. And I do like the positive view that you did take on it, in that everyone's coming together. So there's Black faces, there's white faces, there's diverse faces, which is similar to what we have seen here in the US, which is quite different from what it's been, previously, is that collectively we're all coming together to say, wait a second, this is not right. We want action. We are going to act. Now, burning things down, that's debatable. I know there's a lot of different viewpoints on on what that should be. But the fact that people are standing up and saying we are tired, and also I do want to acknowledge that notion of fatigue, Black fatigue in particular. That's something that we have been dealing with. I know I too personally have experienced it as well. So thank you, Bruno, for sharing. That this is some tiring stuff. It's heavy.
Yeah.
It matters. So thank you for sharing that. And I actually want to jump around a little bit, because Amberly, I know we had spoken a bit about what does it mean when leadership doesn't think that there's a problem. But to Bruno's point, the president saying, this is something that's brought in from the outside. We don't have a problem with issues. And then corporations,
this does not exist.
Right. And then corporations saying, well, if the president, if the government says it's not a problem, then we have no responsibility here. So would love to hear from you, your perspective on what do we do? What do you suggest happen when leadership does not acknowledge that there's a problem? And then Rebecca, after Amberly, from you on the accountability, how do we hold these corporations and governments accountable? So Amberly, I'll turn it to you.
Yeah, it's actually really difficult because there's such a shadow cast by the leader. As Bruno said, if the president doesn't care, that is reflected. And essentially, we see that reflected in the UK. We have a prime minister at the moment who has made racist comments towards Black people, towards Muslim women. And therefore, there is a certain expectation being set, certain things like policies that were progressing within the UK regarding ethnicity pay gap have ground to a halt. And we don't know if that's because of the leader's attitude about prioritizing this, right? And that obviously is mirrored in companies. So depending on how the CEO, the C team reflect and talk about things, we see that being reflected in the way the leaders beneath them start acting. And it can be hugely damaging. So in my own company, I've seen the shift in how much this kind of race-related equity discussions have been prioritized as soon as our CEO got behind us. So as part of the employee resource group that I lead, we engaged right with the top of the organization. We went to the CEO earlier this year, before George Floyd's murder, actually, and said to her, we need to prioritize this. And the minute our CEO engaged, we have had a shift in how the leaders are talking about it. We have seen a shift in the pace of which HR are working on it. So that's essentially the lesson, is that if the leaders get behind what needs to be done, it can really accelerate. If they don't, and as we're seeing in the political circles, it can really lead to a stagnation.
Do you think it's impossible? Do you think so? If I think about community-driven movements where local governments or federal governments do turn blind eyes to things, but the community rises up and says, no, we're going to burn it down and you're going to pay attention. So I'm not suggesting that anyone inside of a company burns anything down, but do you think that that same kind of societal reflection can be mirrored inside of a company where employee resource groups, employee bases, the community rises up and says, we have a problem?
Absolutely, Renee. So the genie is out of the bottle, right? Everybody is talking about this. It's not just happening in one country, it's happening across the globe. So actually, they have to do something about it because society is demanding it. And there is a business imperative, right, for doing this, because we know that innovation the main reason for innovation is diversity of thought. But actually, where does the diversity of thought come from? Diversity of experiences. Where does that come from? From diverse people. The innovation, you actually see that because you have diverse teams. And we know that that's also reflected in a company's performance. Because if they have more innovative ideas, which is fundamental for how a company works, you then end up seeing that in your bottom dollar, which is the most important factor of success for a business, right? And there's also a third reason, right? There's the trust that that company needs to build within its walls as well as externally. So a company has to be selling its product and meeting society's expectations because their product is going to customers, to consumers around the world who will expect that company to be working ethically, right? It makes a huge difference. Also within your employee base, you know, if you're not reflecting what your society around you and what your customers look like, then even within your employee base, you're going to get disenchantment. You're going to get people feeling like our company doesn't really care about our people. It's going to lead to attrition. It's going to lead to low morale. So from all aspects, this is a business imperative. So don't get behind this because you are trying to be kind or nice. Get behind it because it's a business imperative. Your business will fail. And I think I made the point last time that there are many companies around the world that are struggling with this. You know, that their data will show them that they don't have enough ethnic minorities at the top of the organizations around the globe. Most companies are in that bucket, right?
Mm-hmm.
Somehow racism is so part of our everyday life that most organizations have a problem with diversity at the top, right? And therefore they are in great company to start doing something about it now. Don't get left behind when all the other companies have made progress and you're the only one going, there's not really a problem. I don't see a problem, because you will get left behind. So.
Right. And you said so many things that I wanted to like piggyback on and pull the thread on everything you said, but I'll pick up where you left off in that. Back to one of the recommendations that we ended with last time was work together. Companies are in it together. Companies all across the world are facing the same thing. So to ignore it and turn a blind eye is quite foolish, quite frankly, speaking. So acknowledge it, work together, figure it out, and do something. And
absolutely.
Overnight. It will not happen this year. It will not happen next year. It may not happen, true sustainable impact may not, happen until we might not see it for 10 years from now, but it's the incremental steps that you must take to do it. Something you said around ethics, around businesses behaving ethically. And so Rebecca, I want to come to you to talk about that, so something recently happened in Switzerland. I want to make sure that I'm getting it right. November, Switzerland was close to setting a new precedent for responsible business. And so 29th of November, actually, first of its kind decision, the country's parliament voted on a referendum that holds all companies headquartered in Switzerland legally responsible for human rights abuses, environmental exploitation in their supply chains. So this is groundbreaking, both on kind of social justice in and of itself, but then also just precedents that this is sending, that this process is paving, that could be applied to racial justice issues as well. And so this conversation, you spoke a bit about accountability. We must hold governments accountable, we must hold companies accountable, and there's that piece of ethics. So what has happened since, and what does this mean?
Thanks a lot, Renee. So I think it was definitely an extremely exciting time in Switzerland. The fact that, the population here really wanted to hold companies accountable, that you can't just go to China and get, children that are below 6 making your products and get away with it. So, I was particularly proud, as a Swiss and Sierra Leonean national, I was really proud that Switzerland, one of the smallest countries in the world, actually wanted to put in place this type of legislation. What happened with the election is that the popular vote, and which makes me very proud of Swiss people, the popular vote was all for this initiative being implemented. But after the popular vote, you also have the cantons, and the cantons are equivalent to the states in the US. And unfortunately, the states didn't vote for this legislation to be put in place. So the situation we're at right now is because there was a huge, popular vote, people voted for this thing, but the cantons, sort of voted against it. We're sort of developing a compromise. So I think that compromise is still going to hold companies accountable for their behaviors, in their supply chains in other parts of the world. So I think we'll still pretty much end up with something rather pretty good. I think the expectation is that other countries around the world are going to follow suit with this type of an initiative. But I think it sends a really clear message to companies. You need to be responsible. You need to make sure your ethics are top notch, and that you're not doing stuff in other countries that you wouldn't do in your home country. So I think in terms of social justice, as I was saying last time, I think Switzerland does surprise me because, not only with this vote, which was multinational responsable, but I think that there is a lot of leeway in Switzerland to bring up these huge topics around social justice and to, develop these referendums and take them to the public and get the public to vote on them. So that's why I'm pretty optimistic about other issues in social justice that we might be able to bring to the Swiss population for their decision, and that we might be able to implement going forward.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. So it's using the government mechanisms and channels and let the people speak.
Exactly.
The people will continue to speak even when things don't necessarily go their way. I think all of you remember quite vividly, 4 years ago in US elections when there was a certain discrepancy between popular vote and electoral college. Yeah. So we too were very, very familiar with what that's like. Mm-hmm. So thank you for that. Mm-hmm. Switch gears ever so slightly, and Amberly, I want to come to you. Speaking about elections and speaking about, last time we talked about the world's eyes is on this U.S. presidential election, a variety of reasons. One of the reasons that we specifically spoke about was Kamala Harris, first Black woman, first Indian American woman to be considered for vice president, and has since been elected for the vice president position. There was another kind of historic first, that also was in tandem with this election that we did not speak about, but has since kind of raised the flag of, wait a second, there's another first here. And that is that the First Lady, the new First Lady elect, I guess you can say she's been elected, in partnership with her husband. She is a doctorate. So she holds a doctorate in education. And so there's been some opinions floating around that the First Lady having a doctorate and wanting to continue to work while her husband is president, that is just kind of unheard of. Why would she do that? She should drop doctor from her name because she's the First Lady. And so she should be honored to be, considered First Lady, and that's good enough. And so while this is not a race issue per se, it is an issue of gender, and that makes it a social justice issue. So I wonder if you are a doctor yourself, I wonder if you have experiences or anything that you could share to help us shed light on what this conversation is about and how it feels to potentially have been in a like position in this space.
Yeah, this is a topic that is very much related to bias, right? And there's so many parallels between bias because of gender and bias because of race. So I'll tell you a little bit about my own experience first, and then we'll go to the article. So when I was about 24 or 25 when I got my PhD. And obviously because of cultural upbringing, I was a little bit embarrassed to kind of boast about it, right? So when people said, is it Miss or Ms., I would say doctor, but almost whisper it. And so the reaction generally used to be, are you qualified? Or if someone said to me, what do you do? I didn't want to say I'm a postdoc. So I would say I work at a university. And I used to get a response, are you the secretary? And so there was always this assumption that you were, just not good enough, or you were lying about being above your station, or what that perception was of what you were capable of. But some of that was down to also me not speaking up. Right. So as I've gone through life, I've taken a bit more control over that. And so now I assert I'm Dr. Amberly Banerjee. I'm a scientist. right? And so that would be my advice to people who find themselves being spoken down to, is to assert yourself. But there is this pressure on us as ethnic minorities to prove our worth in the first half a minute of them meeting us before they consider us the tea lady or the person doing the cleaning, right? We need to kind of be in there and assert ourselves for what we bring to that conversation. So going back to this particular article that was written, you know, it was it was obviously very annoying reading it, because it is very much talking about bias. And what it reminded me of was in the UK, we have an acerbic sense of humor, and there used to be a funny program called Grumpy Old Men. And this reminded me of one of those skits that grumpy old men used to do, where they used to just moan about something they were unhappy about. It seemed like he, probably unhappy that he hasn't got a PhD or a doctorate, now feels that he can pull down somebody who has achieved that. And it's just that kind of hate, negativity that we tend to see on social media. What is annoying about it, though, is the fact that the Wall Street Journal has given it credibility by publishing it. So that's unfair, because even though the argument is everyone's opinion is valid, we do need to show what is a minority, a tiny minority view versus a majority view, right? There are people who believe in flat earth. You wouldn't give it the same credence as people who believe that the earth is round, right? You would highlight how idiotic flat earth theory is, right? And this is exactly that sort of case. You know, he talks about doctors can't be considered doctors unless they've delivered a child. And actually in the UK, the surgeons, the people who do cesarean section to deliver a child, they do not use the doctor title. Surgeons don't call themselves doctors. So by that definition, they're not proper doctors. So this is just a very biased opinion of one individual and should not have been given the credibility it has been given. I'm going to relate it back to the corporate sector and why this sort of bias is really important to counter. Because what happens is, if the situation continues and a senior leader has higher expectations, you know, an ethnic minority needs to prove that they will hit the bar here in order to qualify for a job here. It's that higher expectations that we are always expected to work to, right? And that's why this kind of having a stereotype, expecting people to hit a higher bar, is actually unfair in the corporate world. And that's what we need to address, why bias actually gets in the way of equity.
Oh my goodness, I'm glad I had myself on mute, because I was saying, amen, yes, I am with you 100%. Unfortunately, have had similar experiences. I'm not doctor, do not have, you know, those credentials, but have had to prove myself within the first 30 seconds, within the first minute, within the first hour, within the first month of working in certain spaces, with certain partners and that kind of thing, simply because of how I show up and who, you know, what I look like and what I show up as. As a woman, that's one thing, and then also as a woman of color too. So I thank you for sharing your experience, and thank you for reflecting on that. In fairness, I do want to just give credit to the Wall Street, and I think you mentioned the article was in the Wall Street Journal, so if anyone is interested in looking it up, it is an opinion piece that was published in the Wall Street Journal this week that reflects obviously on Dr. Joe Biden's use of the I guess, honorific doctor when speaking about herself and her credentials. So please do consider that. So thank you for sharing that. Similarly, I don't know, before I jump into the next question, Rebecca or Bruno, anything that you want to kind of respond to or react to what Ambly just said? Because I'm sure that, no.
About Ambly words, I just want to show my movement. Yes, amen, yes, go. But I agree with everything, because this happened here a lot here in Brazil with Black people, especially Black women. So Emily, you are perfect.
Yeah. What I wanted to add is you both of you mentioned having to prove yourself within the first 30 seconds, within the first minute, within the first hour. But I actually think you actually constantly have to be proving yourself. I don't think it ever stops, actually. You know, and no matter, you could be in a company for 20 years, but I think that you're still constantly proving yourself, but not only upwards, but also downwards when you have a team.
Oh.
So, you know, it's interesting that it just doesn't go in one direction. Everybody is holding you at a higher standard than they would their fellow other colleagues. So I think it's just interesting because that sort of creates a perpetual amount of stress, which is ongoing, which can actually lead to mental issues and burnout and stuff like that. So I think you know, one cannot underestimate how much that impact that has on, you know, the mental health of Black and brown women and men.
Thank
And
you.
Rebecca, even the sort of mistakes we make, right?
Yeah.
We're not allowed to make mistakes, because if we make a mistake, it reflects badly on our entire race.
Yes.
So in my case, as an Indian, if I make a mistake, it's 1.3 billion people that I've let down.
Yeah.
It's just
Everyone.
a ridiculous system
Standard.
to
Yeah.
use.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for sharing that and reminding us and sharing with our viewers who might not have had experience with this, that this is reality, that a lot of us, you know, those who are on the call today feel and experience, and the reality is a lot of your colleagues as well. So the people who you work with every day who may not say this, who may not speak to it, but I'd bet, I'm not a betting woman, but I would bet that they have experienced or felt this, we do daily in some way. And I kind of anecdotally, if any of you have experienced this, but even growing up, I was always taught you have to work twice as hard. You have to work, you have to stay longer, you have to show up earlier, you have to work not 3 times as hard to just be kind of on par, considered on par with your peers. And then when you think about it, you're actually kind of leaps and bounds above your peers, but that is considered good enough or as good as. And so that's a real thing. And I'm so glad you also hit on the mental health aspect as well.
Yes.
So kind of similar, I think that's a nice segue into a similar conversation or similar perspective. Emily and Rebecca, specific to you, as you know, we likely have a lot of our multinational corporate partners joining us on the call today. Of which who sit in the US and might have global responsibilities either through their HR function, through their programmatic social responsibility functions, through foundation functions, what have you, but have a lot of purview and responsibility to global offices and global activities. And again, that could be facilitating programs, that could be hiring, that could be a plethora of things that they're responsible for. So what suggestions or considerations or advice or even questions, you know, would you pose to this audience, to this group to consider as they reflect on their role, the decisions that they're making and the work that they're doing, you know, in their offices that do have that far-reaching impact? And I want to kind of pull that employee thread a bit. We talked a bit about some of the hiring previously, so I'd like to turn that over to you. Rebecca, do you want to go first?
Okay. Yeah. So you know, I specifically, you know, mentioned just earlier, just in the case of Switzerland, you know, we do not have, for example, affirmative action. When someone sends a CV to a potential employer for a job, they need to basically put in their photograph, state their name, their date of birth, their gender, everything. So I think that this sort of leads to situations where people are discriminated off the bat before even having an interview. And I think some of the things that, you know, should be considered, especially in the case of Switzerland, is maybe just having practices where you sort of have blind recruitment, where you judge somebody basically on their skills, their qualifications, and their experience, but not necessarily in some of the other issues which are very open to bias. So that would be a case that I would specifically share for Switzerland, which I think is a little bit behind in terms of just maintaining that objectivity when hiring people, just to ensure that it's a fairer process than it is today.
Thanks, Rebecca. So From a company like ours, a multinational organization, one of the things I hear is, we just don't have the diversity when we apply for or advertise roles. We just don't get black and brown people applying for these jobs. We don't have them even part of our application process. And I always say, look at the root cause. Why is that? That's because of the societal injustices that exist, right? We tend to go, because we're a blue chip company, we want to hire from the best universities, the top universities, which generally doesn't have that many black and brown people within its population. Therefore, they need to look more widely. So how can they support, and that means actually feeding the pipeline, not just starting by looking at what their company hiring processes are, but actually supporting local schools, supporting universities where these individuals might be studying, providing them access. I mean, GSK does a great mentoring program with local universities where GSK employees act as mentors for some of these kids that have never had anybody in their family who's gone on to universities. They just have no idea of corporate life. So that's where a company can actually look at the root causes behind some of the things that they are supporting. So another example is we're a healthcare company, right? But there's a lot of societal healthcare inequalities that exist in the world, right? There's not equal access to medicines. So again, GSK is a huge supporter of global health. Again, looking where is the need related to whatever it is that your company is working on, and how can you impact the bigger problems in society rather than just looking within your company's remit, because these things will have an impact on you. So we might be helping a project in Africa because they're not having access to medicines. But tomorrow's economy, Africa could be a huge power player in this business context, right? So how do you start influence future changes? That's what you're talking about, right? Building the infrastructure. And I do want to make one last point that we covered last time, which is it's absolutely critical that we look at the local demographics. When you're US-based organization trying to set up solutions in other parts of the world, it's absolutely fundamental that you gain local insights. So as an example, for instance, in the UK, just even simple things like our UK government uses the term BAME to refer to non-white people, right? So BAME means Black, Asian, Minority, Ethnic. Now the UK government used this term, but there's been a huge backlash to having this term being used. Now you can imagine a company with all the best intent in the world that doesn't realize this public sentiment where people don't want to be referred to as BAME. They come in and try to do something for that community in the UK and they start advertising, marketing things for BAME people. It's not going to land in the right way, right? So this is really about making sure you keep your ear to the ground in the countries where you want to influence change and use local insights to formulate your strategies.
Yes, thank you for that. Rebecca, you look like you wanted to say something. Did you want to respond?
No, I was just, just really totally agreeing with what Amberly was saying. I think another thing that, I would also add is, I think, companies sometimes tend to sort of say, we're going to open up an office in China, and then they'll send a European to China to run that office. And I think that has always sort of caused a stir in the organization, because you have Chinese people in the company, highly trained, that could actually go back to China and actually do an excellent job. So I think companies also need to look into their talent whenever they want to go into these different geographies. Look at what you have and the talent that you have internally, and maybe send that talent to those countries rather than send in expats and stuff like that. Not expats, but rather than sending people that are very culturally different from the culture at hand. So I was just agreeing with Amberly, because I think, listen to that local, have your ear to the ground, listen, and make decisions based in those specific environments rather than making decisions that could seem a little bit Eurocentric in nature.
I couldn't agree more, 100%. And I think that it sounds simple, the very simple sentiment. It's not simple in practice, but simple sentiment can be applied across anything. So when it comes to opening new offices and expanding business, it could be applied to, as I mentioned, social impact programs, you know, to support communities and develop communities, but coming in with that listening ear, understanding the realities, understanding the root causes of some of the problems that have been experienced in the communities, what has worked, what has already been tried, what hasn't, not coming in with the answer or the solution or the correct way to do it. Same thing for hiring is looking at, why don't you have more diverse faces around the table? Does that mean you really don't have them already, you know, in your midst? If so, or if not, if you don't have them, why not? Where are you pulling talent from? How are you screening them? How are they being recruited? How are they being educated? And how do you really understand the needs of your business as it relates to, you know, the talent that you can draw from or have access to or can be looking at. So I think that very simple sentiment can be applied across so many different facets. Go ahead, Rebecca.
I just wanted to add something. And I think also just sort of being less defensive, because my experience is that everybody just gets really defensive about it. If you sort of say, well, there are not enough diverse faces, and then this defensiveness comes in and this fragility comes in, and then it just becomes like a opposition, controversial, and you can't really make a lot of leeway or really progress in that environment. So I think it's just having this candid discussion that we just need to leave that defensiveness at the door and just look at the situation like it really is, you know. And so that defensiveness, I think, actually prevents many conversations from happening and progress from actually taking place. And I think it's the type of contract that I think needs to happen within the company. Let's have this candid discussion. Let's not be defensive. You know, when I say there are not enough diverse phases in the company, I'm not blaming anybody. It's just a fact. And let's try and change that.
How, and I'm not even sure how to phrase this question, but how does one know that they are being defensive? So how does one know if a fact is being brought to the attention of leadership, and leadership responds or reacts in a certain way? How do they know that they are actually being defensive and they actually are prohibiting progress from happening when, in their mind, it might just be, I'm just responding? Or, you know, how does one acknowledge that they are being defensive and actually hurting things?
Yeah, you know, that's a really interesting question. And I think that people do see when they're being defensive because their emotions, you know, their emotions start rising, and the tension starts rising. And I think if we're just really very honest with ourselves, you know, we do see that happening when we become defensive. And so that's why I would say it takes a lot of maturity to have this discussion. But I think it's something like, just referring to what Amberly said, if we want to progress, if we want to grow, if we, you know, and we want to be the best pharma company in the world, for example, we're going to need to have those uncomfortable discussions and realize when we are getting defensive or emotionally, you know, sort of, you know, taken in by an argument. But we should just really look at the facts. And that's why, you know, when I talk about anti-racism education, I think it's really important to do this in a very non-aggressive type of way, just to get the best results. And I think we need to probably find a roadmap to do that in companies as well.
I think you hit the nail on the head as you were saying the emotions. I immediately thought feelings. You physically feel something. When your defense mechanisms, when that system is activated, you feel shoulders might get tense, you might get a pit in your stomach, you might start to ache. So it's paying attention to your body and not keep here. Oftentimes we intellectualize these issues and we intellectualize things of race and justice and that kind of thing, and we keep it all up here when your body is sending you a tremendous amount of signals and indicators that you know might say otherwise. So it's, how do you pay attention to what your body is saying and yourself to be vulnerable for some distance of vulnerability, to acknowledge, you know, so thank you for highlighting that.
Renay, just a quick couple of points. I mean, there is defensiveness where sometimes it can manifest as just inaction, right? Which is great. Oh, there's just a lack of action. So they might not say anything to you, but you can tell by the fact that nothing is happening. Now, there is also, with the amount of attention ethnicity has had, I've also seen that there are in some quarters some discomfort because people feel like white men are now being put to the back of some hypothetical queue. And I've started to hear that kind of sentiment bubble up as well. You can see Rebecca's nodding along. And actually, to counter that, what I tend to do is I mean, this is not a hidden issue, right? There are reports after studies after studies proving that this is a real thing. One of the latest reports that I've been sending to people who say to me, well, this is not really an issue though, is it? Is a report by McKinsey and Company, where they've looked at white men right throughout the career, basically. White men make up about 35% of entry-level roles in the US specific data. By the time they get to C-suite, there are 65% of them are white. Black women, 18% of the workforce, but at the end, there are only 3% in C-suite. So that kind of data shows you why we need to act on this, and it's kind of very clear. And that's the sort of evidence that we need to use to kind of bring along the people who are resistant to accepting that there is work to do.
Wow. That's all I can say. Thank you. Thank you for that. And thank you for sharing. I'm going to have to look up that study. Thank you for sharing that. And I did see, Rebecca, you nodding in heavy agreement there. Bruno, I don't know if you've experienced same thing, kind of that loss of power sentiment. So there's now a concern that, wait a minute, I'm losing something. You know, white men feel like they are now having to relinquish something in order for someone else to be recognized, which I think we can probably go on a whole different conversation about. But before we end, I did want to quickly give Bruno or Rebecca any thoughts, because it seemed like you both were in agreement of that. Any experiences or thoughts that you'd like to share around that point?
Sorry, Rebecca, you can say.
No, sorry. Go ahead, Bruno. Go ahead. I'll speak after.
So I'm totally agree with Emily and Rebecca saying until now. And here in Brazil, we have the same problem with the white people that but stay on this kind of defense statement. So for me as a black man, when I say something, people, oh, why are you so angry? Mm-hmm. I'm not angry. I just write. and I think, what can I do to these people understand me without all this anger that we can see? I think white people need, first of all, reading some books. We need to give some books for white people, because they don't understand the white privilege. In this white privilege here is a thing that people say, oh, this does not exist. Everyone is equal. No, everyone's not equal. So we need to read some books about your white privilege to understand how the way you say is different than the way I say something. When I say something, I look angry. When you say something, you look just right. You look just fine. And so it's the same for black women here in Brazil is the worst for when we compare for black men. Black men have received some fear. People have some fear about black men, but black women doesn't receive respect when they speak in a room. When she is a director or a doctor, she doesn't receive the right respect that she owns, right? So it's the same scenario. I don't have any positive points again today. I don't have any positive points. Hey, Renay, just fact.
Thank you. Well, thank you for that. And Rebecca, did you want to share anything?
Yes, I wanted to share something. I think what this situation is creating, this perception that white men are pushed to the back of the queue, it's actually creating situations and tensions actually within organizations, envy and jealousy, and what happens is that shows up in many different ways, whereby you have colleagues that try to basically not contribute to some of the projects that you do because they don't want to be part of your success. So I think it is a big problem. It's a big thing that's brewing that companies are going to have to address, because white men are really feeling that, hey, no one wants to hire me anymore. And it's something that I think society is going to have to sort of put on the table and very, very, very clearly address, you know, in the space of a few years, in my opinion, or else it's just going to be very counterproductive in companies.
And it sounds like, just from all of the sentiments that you all have shared on the last conversation and even in this conversation, is that, again, those tensions or what happens inside of those walls do translate outside. So my concern is that, you know, some of those tensions might manifest in the community, might manifest in, you know, kind of some of the development things that are happening in the rebuilding, and might, dare I say it, but intentionally, you know, destruct or, you know, kind of thwart some of the progress that has been made for fear of the threat.
Exactly.
So my prayer is that we do, as you said, societally and globally speaking, and organizationally speaking. I mean, it starts with calling it out when you see it in your office, in your walls, on your team, you know, community. I do pray that we are able to address it. So as per usual, even, you know, like our last conversation, we could go on for another 5 hours. But we cannot do that. So I do want to bring us to a close, and I'm going to ask a question that I'd like each of you to respond to, and then we'll kind of end on that note. And that is, what are your top recommendations for your peers, your colleagues? So not designated leadership, not the chiefs, not the VPs, not the senior VPs, not HR, not diversity and inclusion, but your peers and your colleagues, those that you work with on your team, those who, you know, you work with across border, anyone who actually can lead from where they are. What's your recommendation to them toward contributing toward systemic change? And I'll leave it to you. I know it's a big one to discuss, so you can go first.
So for me, I think the most important thing is get to know the other person and put yourself in their shoes. Get to know the other person. We're human beings. And, you know, it's that simple in my mind. I think a lot of the fear stems from stereotypes, judgments about people that look different. And when you get to know human beings, you actually begin to see that they're very much like you. They want, you know, they want to have food on the table. They want to have a roof over their head. They want their children to do well in school. They maybe want to have a dog or a cat, and they want to maybe have a nice car. And at the end of the day, that is what humanity is all about. I went to school, and I went to an international school, and in the beginning, you know, I was very much bullied in this international school. And later on, you know, towards graduation, I formed a family with a lot of people in that school, people that I talk to today. And a lot of my friends, you know, live in either Pakistan or Iran, Iraq, you know, Turkmenistan, Russia, Japan. And whenever we sort of connect, you know, what I see is not that they look different or that they're in a different culture. What I see is the human being. So, you know, my wish is if we could all be like that, get to know the other and just see what really drives us, as we're all human beings. I think that's when we start getting to that place where we should be at already, but we're taking some time to get there. But that is what humanity needs to get to, from my perspective.
Thank you. At the foundation, get to know the other.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Perfect.
That's beautiful, Rebecca. I love get to know the other. Mine is simple as well. We all have a part to play. You know, we don't need a degree or a PhD in inclusion and diversity.
Right.
It is as simple as, what can you do in your sphere of control? You know, whether it's at work or in your social circles. If it's at work, there's a whole host of things you can do about small actions to help someone who's different than you know, mentor them. Look at what programs that your company is running for community projects. You know, you can take small personal actions to educate yourself, join an employee resource group, and mix with people who are not like you. So there are provisions in the corporate world, in the work setting, but absolutely, to Rebecca's point, you don't need to wait for that. You know, just be curious, because the more you get to know somebody, really, we all had the same essential concerns
Yeah.
Be
and want to
curious.
live in a fair society, right? At the end of the day, that's all we're asking for, a fair
Mhm.
society.
Yeah.
So, thank you. Bruno?
So for me, the most important thing is in the world is information for me, and the knowledge, this information, the way we can learn something about something. As I always say in class, the important thing is not to know everything about a single people or a single thing, but the most important is know a little, just a little, about a lot of things and about a lot of people.
Mhm.
So when you know more people and the different people, you have more knowledge, you have more information. And the second thing, and once again, we're back in the story. People need to read more books. Seriously, seriously, seriously.
Yes.
The most important weapon that we have are the books, the history. People need to know more about the history, the real history, not the right history, the total history. So, and then I talk about again the white privilege, because when we start this thing about know more about all the people, we need to know about white privilege. We need to know that just because the color of their skin, white people have more chance to live, to work, to receive a better payment. Uh, and when these white people understand their privilege and their guilt with all this thing that happened with us, maybe they start to think that we don't want their place. We just want a place side by them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. Oh my gosh, that was so eloquently and beautifully stated. And I love how this was unplanned, but you each pretty much said, you know, a very complimentary thing, that it's about humanity. It's about the humanness of it. It's about getting to know each other. It's about educating ourselves. It's
Yeah.
about fairness. It's about the history. I cannot do it any greater justice than what you just said. Thank you for sharing that.
In Portuguese, this is more beautiful than my English. Sorry.
No. You said it. You said it perfectly.
Mhm.
And I think the only thing, Bruno, that what you just said has left me with is learning is two-way. It's a two-way street. You know, we too, as a woman of color, I too need to learn, you know, about privilege and about the guilt and about the history and about so many other things. So it's a two-way street.
Mhm.
So I leave you with the think boldly, move faster, do more. Not much else to be said beyond that. I just encourage us all here on the panel today. I encourage everyone who's listening to kind of take these concepts, take our conversation to heart, reflect on what we shared, and really kind of dive into something that resonated with you and figure out what it means for you. Not everything we spoke about is applicable to every person. I would venture to believe that at least one thing that we spoke about did resonate with someone in a unique way. So I implore you not to ignore that, and to really unpack what that is. So of course, happy to continue the conversation. If anyone listening today has any questions, ideas, want to work together, want to continue to explore what all of this means and how you, in each of your roles within your community and or your company, can work together to dismantle some of these terrible structures that we have in place. Here's my contact information. Would love to learn from you and work with you on how to do that. So to Bruno, to Rebecca, to Ambly, thank you yet again
Thank you.
for
Thank you.
spending some time with me.
Thank you,
This
Renee.
much needed
Thank you.
conversation.
Thanks,
And I
Renee.
wasn't kidding when I said we could probably go on for hours. If we were all together, we would be there with our glass of wine or tea or
Yeah.
coffee, just laughing the night away.
Please come to Brazil.
Yes,
Come to
we have
Brazil and
to.
we talk in a beach.
Excellent. Well, thank you each. And until next time, thank you for
Yeah.
listening.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Bruno. Thanks, Renee.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Rebecca.
Thank
Thank
you,
you, Renee.
everyone.
Thank you, Emily.
Bye.
Thanks.